This is Dimitri Lascaris reporting for the Real News Network from Toronto, Canada. The scientific community's ability to predict levels of future global warming depends critically on the accuracy of their climate models. That's why climate scientists are constantly working to improve the accuracy of those models. One of the scientific groups that has been developing a new, more sophisticated climate model is the Canadian Centre for Climate Modelling, or CCCMA. This is an arm of the Canadian government, and among other things, it carries out climate model experiments coordinated by the World Climate Research Program in support of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The new climate model being developed by the CCCMA is called the Canadian Earth System Model version 5. The CCCMA has begun to apply its model version 5 to different future emission scenarios, and the results are alarming. Now here to discuss this with us is Dr. Neil Swart. Dr. Swart is a research scientist at the Canadian Centre for Climate Modelling and Analysis, and we thank you today for joining us, Dr. Swart.
Thanks for having me on.
So before we discuss the estimates of future warming being generated by this newer model, could you please explain to our viewers how, in your view, this model is an improvement on the prior generation of models and where it fits into the bigger picture of the work being done by the IPCC to improve the accuracy of predictions of future warming?
Okay, I'll start with the second question first. So where it fits in with the work of the IPCC. So the IPCC draws together many different lines of evidence to help us understand historical climate change and then to make estimates of what climate change we might experience in the future. And so this includes observations, physical understanding, and one of the lines of evidence that the IPCC uses are these comprehensive climate models, such as CANI-SM5 that we develop here. In terms of how CANI-SM5 has improved from its predecessor, so these are comprehensive models. They include a representation of the atmosphere, of the ocean, of the land surface, of sea ice. And over the past 7 years or so, the scientists that work here have gone to work improving the representation of each of these components of the climate system within the model. And we can show that there is demonstrably better skill, so the model is more accurately representing reality than its predecessor, CANI-SM2.
Now, before I ask you about the results that have been generated by the model, I want to explain briefly to our viewers what SSP1 and SSP5 are all about, because I understand that these are two of the future emission scenarios that have been analyzed with the Earth System Model 5. Over the past few years, an international team of climate scientists, economists, and energy system modelers have built a range of new pathways that examine how global society, demographics, and economics might change over the next century. They are collectively known as the Shared Socioeconomic Pathways, or SSPs. SSP1 envisions that the world shifts gradually but pervasively toward a more sustainable path, emphasizing more inclusive development that respects perceived environmental boundaries, whereas SSP5 envisions that the world places increasing faith in competitive markets, innovation, and participatory societies to produce rapid technological progress. In this scenario, the push for economic and social development is coupled with the exploitation of abundant fossil fuel resources and the adoption of resource and energy-intensive lifestyles around the world. So, Dr. Swart, how much warming by 2100 did model version 5 predict under these two scenarios, SSP1 and SSP5?
Okay, so when we're talking about how much warming, it's important to say relative to which that warming is. Are we talking about warming relative to today? Or what we like to talk about is warming relative to a pre-industrial period, so before humans really had an influence on the climate system. In this particular model, CANI-SM5, the warming relative to that pre-industrial period is about roughly 2.5 degrees under SSP1, and it's significantly higher under the SSP 585, which is over 6 degrees. It's between 7 and 8 degrees Celsius warming relative to pre-industrial.
Now that, as I indicated at the outset, that's quite an alarming figure, 7 to 8 degrees Celsius by 2100 under SSP5. How did these predictions compare to the predictions generated by the prior generation of climate models? It seems that they're significantly higher. And also, are the newer models being developed by other groups of scientists yielding results similar to those of this model?
Okay, so to the first question, how does this compare to the previous round? Well, one slight nuance is that as you were talking about the group of social scientists and economists that come up with these scenarios, well, just like we improve the climate models through every cycle of this assessment process, they also improve or come up with new scenarios. And so these exact scenarios were actually not run in the previous assessment. There were ones that were similar to this, but not exactly the same. But so relative to the last round, what we do know is that the models say per unit of CO2 that's emitted, this particular model warms significantly more than its predecessor did. And so if we run this exact same scenario, SSP585, with our current model, we would get more warming than we would if we had run it with the previous generation. And as it turns out, this is not only true for our model, CANI-SM5, but there's a number of leading modeling centers around the world. About 25 or so modeling centers exist around the world that do similar work to us. Many of the larger ones, including in the United States and the United Kingdom, have also seen this increase, what we call climate sensitivity, which is how much warming you get per doubling of CO2. And so this is something that seems to be occurring across the community, or at least across several models in the community. It's not isolated to CANI-SM5.
Now, SSP1, I think you indicated what the model is, the newer model is envisioning is approximately 2.5 degrees Celsius of warming under SSP1. Is that correct? By 2100?
Yeah. Excuse me. In this particular model, yes, it would be over 2 degrees of warming, something around, I believe it's 2.4 by the end of the century.
And do you think it's fair to describe SSP1 as a relatively strong mitigation scenario? Where
absolutely.
Right. So in light of that, Dr. Swart, and perhaps there's so many factors that will play ultimately into the outcomes we achieve, and very difficult to predict, especially from a political perspective, how future governments are going to deal with this burgeoning climate emergency. But is it, in your view, realistic at this stage to imagine that we are going to avoid at least 2 degrees Celsius of warming over the pre-industrial period, given the numbers we're now seeing from these newer and more sophisticated climate models?
I would say that, again, so these are just results from one model, and there are other models that would be on the lower end of the warming spectrum. So I just want to put that into context. And in addition, there are other lines of evidence, as I mentioned earlier, including observations and so on. So when you draw those lines of evidence together, what you can come up with is an estimate of how strong our mitigation activities would have to be, how much we would have to change our behaviors and reduce CO2 emissions in order to avoid 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming. And what we're beginning to see is that particularly for 1.5 degrees, that would require extremely strong mitigation. And for example, if you compare what has been promised currently by governments around the world, what are the commitments that have been made? These commitments are not sufficient for us to achieve certainly a 1.5 degree target, and likely not a 2 degree target, but they likely put us on track for something more like 3 degrees of warming.
Well, we've been speaking to Dr. Neil Swart of the Canadian Centre for Climate Modelling and Analysis about a new climate model being developed within the Canadian government. Thank you very much for joining us today, Dr. Swart.
Thank you for having me on.
And this is Dimitri Lascaris for the Real News Network.